It was defined on the basis of protecting the common interests of working men. And the group adopted as one of its first goals the 8-hour day. Yeah, I should have had this up already, but so that in a working man's republic, no one should be worked to death by having to work 10 or 12 hours a day. So eight hours a day and half a day on Saturday was the goal. And at this time, generally speaking, most Americans, the average American working person worked 60 hours a week, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they had Sunday off. So the Knights of Labor pursued the goal of essentially a 44-hour work week. 8 hours a day for Monday through Friday, 4 hours on Saturday morning, and then you had the rest of the weekend off. Basically, though the goal was controversial, very controversial, by the beginning of the 20th century, that had become the norm and would remain the norm until through World War II. And after World War II, we get the 40-hour week, with getting the whole weekend off being the norm. Let's see. And the other a major goal that they advanced was government ownership of the railroads. It was the only particular thing that might be considered socialistic about their program. But they viewed the railroads as a public utility that had been developed with government subsidies and served everybody, and therefore the fairest thing to do was to have the railroads be a publicly owned corporation under the control of the government. Now, even if the Knights of Labor was officially open to all workers, regardless of race, in practice it was not. That was pretty much the first place where this ambitious and idealistic and even utopian program broke apart. California chapters of the Knights of Labor explicitly and proudly excluded Chinese workers from joining. And indeed, the Knights of Labor in California adopted as its primary campaign an active and successful effort to drive Chinese from most of the jobs they had occupied since coming to California during the gold rush and after. Now, some leaders of the Knights of Labor spoke out against the anti-Chinese activity, but their pleas were unheeded. And in the South, the relationship between black chapters of the Knights of Labor and white chapters of the Knights of Labor was very uncomfortable. And in 1886, the Knights of Labor held its first national convention in the South, in Richmond, Virginia. And the controversies surrounding social interaction between white and black delegates became one of the major issues at the conference, sort of overwhelming the more political, the other priorities that they had set. The Knights of Labor had a brief moment of extraordinary success. In 1885, the Knights of Labor won a major victory over the National Railroad lines. And the organization's membership climbed from approximately 250,000 to 750,000 in the course of a year. Now, any of you who know organizational theory know that no organization can possibly manage a tripling of size. There was going to be confusion and inefficiency built into the situation. But the Knights felt that they were on the verge of achieving political power and not just trade union power. And in 1886, they began efforts to launch a new third party that would be a labor party. And they began running candidates for office, and many of their candidates won. Because the Knights had a lot of popular support, even from people who were not members or did not have family members. People across the country liked much of what the Knights were talking about. So they seemed poised to transform the political arena and begin to legislate the goals that they had set, which had long been, at least for the previous decade, the thing that they had been talking about. They would engage employers, they would have strikes, they would have contracts, but the real goal was to enter into political contests, win a majority of state legislatures and a majority of Congress, perhaps elect the president, and then make their program the basis for national legislation, and thus reform the country using the democratic institutions of the Republic. But they seemed poised to transform the country, but they perhaps had fallen into a trap. Jay Gould, who was the owner, the head of the railroad cartels and the owner of, well, several of them, but the line that ran from Chicago to Seattle was his biggest line. He was the one who had convinced his fellow railroad owners that they should settle with the Knights of Labor. And he was already known, because of his role as the most public figure of the railroad industry, as the most hated man in America. So his surrender to the Knights of Labor was particularly symbolic. And this was an important part of their ability to start attracting hundreds of thousands of people into the organization. Well, the following year, he forced the Knights of Labor into another round of strikes. Confident that they would not be, particularly given their previous success and their new organizational problems, that they would not be able to handle this strike effectively. In any event, in 1887, Gould abrogated all of his contracts with the Knights. He fired all of his workers who belonged to the organization. And the strike that the Knights of Labor tried to organize against him failed. He took credit for having defeated what he considered the most dangerous threat to the rights of property that had ever been faced in the history of mankind, as he put it. The Knights of Labor, while it was a national organization, was locally organized. The national leadership could not tell the local chapters what to do, or vice versa. The local chapters had no authority over the national leadership. Some of the chapters in the Knights of Labor were trade unions, some were neighborhood groups, some were reading clubs, and others were simply affiliations of individuals who liked the social events that the Knights put on, or who liked the label being a Knight of Labor. Terence Powderly, who was the head of the Knights of Labor, was a charismatic figure, but he was also autocratic, and he didn't like having to negotiate with anybody, even within his own organization. He liked to pronounce. So he might have actually, in fact, been a good leader for a group that did not have a centralized organization, but just needed someone to say, I can see a day in which all of our children are going to college. And all of our sons and daughters have skills that that will bring them good-paying jobs. So in effect, the Knights of Labor was neither a trade union organization nor a political party. It was a broad-based social movement, but it lacked the basis for focusing on particular struggles. So the struggle with the second struggle with the railroad cartels in 1887 led to a major defeat and many people leaving. But the most important exit from the Knights of Labor came from the crafts unions, who were the wealthiest groups within the Knights of Labor. In 1886, a majority of craft unions withdrew from the Knights of Labor to organize a competing organization, the American Federation of Labor, which obviously still exists today. The American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations. We'll get to why the hyphen later, but the American Federation of Labor was founded in 1886 when the major craft unions universally exited from the Knights of Labor to form their own organization. This new group was clearly focused on the practical goals that trade unions could achieve. And the American Federation of Labor sought to protect the interests of its membership and not of all producers in general. Now, the impetus, this exit came before the Knights of Labor's defeat in 1887. So what were the factors leading to the exit? One was increasing dismay at the way in which the Knights of Labor was becoming a catch-all for all kinds of people with all kinds of ideas, and was lacking a focus. And the trade unions wanted to maintain the focus on labor issues. But there was something very specific that occurred in 1886 that prompted the craft unions to make this exit. And that was the Haymarket Riot, the so-called Haymarket Riot of 1886. The Haymarket Riot. This is it's one of the most seminal events in labor history, though U.S. labor history. A group, German workers were on strike. Their trade union was run by anarchists, and they were having a rally at